went camping in the California mountains with a few friends last weekend. We picked a quiet spot surrounded by tall pine trees and set up our tents. The air was crisp and the stars were bright. Everything seemed perfect for a relaxing getaway. As night fell, we sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The forest around us was dark and silent, except for the crackling of the fire. We laughed and enjoyed ourselves until we decided it was time to hit the sack. After crawling into my sleeping bag, I tried to drift off to sleep. But the forest was unusually quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I told myself it was probably just my imagination and tried to relax. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a faint noise. It sounded like scratching or digging. I sat up in my sleeping bag and listened carefully, trying to figure out what it was. The noise seemed to be coming from the direction of our trash can. I quietly unzipped my tent and peeked outside. The moonlight made the trees look eerie, and I could barely see anything. I reached for my car keys and clicked the unlock button. The light from my car flashed, illuminating the area around the trash can. As the light blinked on, I saw a small figure in Hmong clothes crouched next to the trash can. It looked like a child, but something about it didn't seem right. The figure was digging through the trash with frantic movements. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I clicked the lock button again, and the light flashed once more. The figure froze, and for a moment, I saw its face clearly. It was pale with wide, dark eyes. The child's expression was oddly serious, and there was something unsettling about the way it stared at me. I quickly clicked the unlock button again, and the figure started moving again as if it didn't care that I was watching. It continued to dig through the trash with increasing desperation. I didn't know what to do, so I stayed frozen in place. The scratching noises grew louder, and I noticed that the figure seemed to be gathering something from the trash. It looked like scraps of paper and broken bits of food. I felt a chill run down my spine as I wondered why it was so intent on finding these things. Then, without warning, the figure stopped and stood up. It turned slowly to face me, its dark eyes reflecting the faint light. I felt a shiver of fear. The figure seemed to be searching for something, or perhaps someone. I had no idea what it wanted. I clicked the unlock button again, hoping the light would scare it off. But instead, the figure started to walk towards me, its movements jerky and unnatural. My heart raced, and I quickly jumped back into my tent, zipping it up tightly. Inside my tent, I whispered to my friends, trying to wake them up. They groggily stirred and listened as I told them what I'd seen. They were skeptical, but agreed to check it out with me. We carefully unzipped our tent and peered outside, but the figure was gone. The trash can was now in disarray, with the contents scattered around. The forest was silent once again, but the eerie feeling remained. We decided to stay up for the rest of the night, keeping watch for any signs of the strange figure. As dawn approached, we packed up our things and left the campsite, still uneasy about what we had experienced. To this day, I'm not sure who or what that figure was. The image of it digging through our trash and staring at me with those dark, hollow eyes still sends shivers down my spine. We never went back to that campsite, and I don't think I ever want to. I went camping in the woods of California one crisp fall evening, wanting to escape from the city's chaos. The air was cool and filled with the scent of pine, and the sun dipped below the horizon as I set up my tent. That night, I decided to go hunting, hoping to catch something for dinner and maybe enjoy the peacefulness of the forest. The moonlight made the woods look almost magical as I walked along the creek, my footsteps muffled by the fallen leaves. I was just about to turn back when I saw her. She was sitting alone on the edge of the creek, her figure faintly illuminated by the moon. She seemed almost like a part of the night itself, so still and quiet. Her beauty was striking, but something about her didn't seem quite right. As I drew closer, I noticed she didn't have any ears, and her hands had only 2 fingers each. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should approach, but curiosity got the better of me. She turned her head and looked directly at me with eyes that seemed almost too deep. "Will you stay here with me?" she asked in a soft voice. "I don't want to go home anymore." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. There was something unsettling about her request. I tried to keep my voice steady as I replied, "I'm sorry, but I can't stay. I have to get back to my campsite." I hoped she would understand and let me go. I walked away quickly, trying not to look back. The woods seemed darker and colder now, and I could feel the weight of her gaze on my back. When I finally reached my campsite, I was relieved to see the comforting glow of the campfire. I threw some logs onto the fire and tried to shake off the feeling of unease. As I lay in my sleeping bag that night, sleep came slowly. When I finally did drift off, I had a dream that I was back at the creek. The woman was there again, sitting just as she had before. This time she looked sad and hurt, and her eyes seemed to pierce through me. In the dream, I tried to tell her that I had changed my mind, that I wanted to stay with her, but no matter what I said, she only stared at me with those deep, haunting eyes. I could hear the sound of the creek, but it seemed to grow louder and more insistent. Suddenly, the dream shifted. I was running through the forest, but no matter how fast I went, I couldn't escape the eerie feeling that followed me. I could hear whispers in the wind, and they seemed to be saying my name over and over. I woke up in a cold sweat, the campfire's warmth now seeming distant and weak. The night was still, but the silence was heavy. I looked around, half expecting to see the woman standing at the edge of the firelight watching me. I tried to go back to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I could see her sad face and hear the whispers. The darkness outside my tent felt oppressive, like it was pressing in on me. In the early hours of the morning, I decided to pack up and leave. The thought of staying any longer filled me with dread. As I hurriedly gathered my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally drove away from the campsite, I looked back one last time. The forest seemed to be shrouded in a thick fog, and I thought I saw a faint figure by the creek. I didn't stop to look closer. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. I drove home in silence, the events of the night replaying in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake, that I had left something behind that I should have stayed for. To this day, I wonder about that woman and what might have happened if I had stayed. Sometimes, when the moon is full and the night is quiet, I think I hear whispers in the wind, and I remember the haunting eyes of the woman by the creek. It was supposed to be a fun camping trip with my friends in the California mountains. We had been planning this getaway for months, eager to escape the city and enjoy nature. The sky was clear, the air was crisp, and the lake looked inviting as we set up our tents and gathered around the campfire for dinner. As the night grew darker, we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The sounds of the forest surrounded us, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the wind, and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. We felt safe, cocooned in our little camping world. Little did we know something was watching us from the shadows. After we finished our s'mores, we decided to go down to the lake to cool off our feet. The moonlight cast a silvery glow over the water, making it shimmer like a blanket of stars. We laughed and splashed around, enjoying the peacefulness of the night. Suddenly, I noticed something unusual. The water seemed to ripple in a strange pattern, like something large was moving underneath. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, thinking it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But the ripples grew bigger and closer, and my heart started to race. I looked around at my friends, who were still having fun, unaware of the growing tension in the air. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A massive snake, as big as a couch, with thick, dark scales and a single sinister horn on its head. It was partially submerged in the water, its body undulating like a serpent's as it moved with surprising grace. The horn on its head glinted in the moonlight, adding a menacing edge to its appearance. The snake didn't seem to notice us at first. It was focused on something else, perhaps hunting or exploring. My breath caught in my throat as I realized how close it was. I glanced at my friends, hoping they would notice the danger, but they were still blissfully unaware. Panic surged through me. I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped in my chest. I grabbed a flashlight and, trying to keep my hands steady, pointed it towards the snake. Its scales gleamed eerily in the light, and the horn seemed to pulsate with a dark energy. Slowly, the snake began to move towards the lake's edge. Its movements were deliberate and unnervingly silent. I could see the ripples in the water growing more pronounced as its massive body shifted and slid. Each movement was like a warning, sending shivers down my spine. I turned to my friends and finally managed to shout, "Get out of the water, now!" They looked at me in confusion, but when they saw the fear in my eyes, they scrambled to the shore. I could see the panic spreading among them as they realized something was wrong. We all huddled together, watching in terrified silence as the snake continued its slow journey towards the lake's deeper sections. The horn on its head seemed to glow faintly, casting eerie shadows on the water. It moved with an unsettling calmness, as if it were used to being the dominant force in the area. As the snake submerged further into the lake, its massive body disappeared beneath the surface, leaving only faint ripples behind. We stood there, frozen as the ripples slowly faded away. The moonlight reflected off the now calm water, but the peace of the night felt utterly broken. We quickly packed up our things, the fun of the camping trip overshadowed by the terrifying encounter. We didn't dare to stay another minute. Our laughter and joy had turned to fear and urgency, and we were eager to leave the ominous presence of the snake behind us. As we drove away from the campsite, the darkness of the forest seemed to press in around us. We talked in hushed voices, trying to make sense of what we had seen. The giant snake, with its horn and scales, was a nightmare we would never forget. When we finally reached the safety of our homes, we couldn't shake the image of that monstrous creature. The memories of its horn glinting in the moonlight and its massive body moving with unsettling grace haunted our thoughts. We knew we had narrowly escaped a danger that could have been much worse. I live in California, and last summer, my friends and I decided to go camping in the woods near our town. The area was known for its beautiful views and quiet nights, so we were excited to escape the hustle and bustle of daily life. Little did we know, our trip would take a terrifying turn. We arrived at the campsite in the afternoon, set up our tents, and gathered around the fire pit to roast marshmallows. The sun set quickly, and soon it was dark. We told stories around the campfire, the kind that make you laugh and shiver at the same time. The night was still and peaceful. As the fire died down, I noticed something strange. There was a large tree nearby, its branches stretching high above us. I saw something moving on top of the tree, but I couldn't make out what it was. I thought it was just a bird or maybe a squirrel, so I didn't mention it to my friends. Later, when we were getting ready for bed, I heard a soft scratching noise coming from above. I looked out of my tent and saw that the thing I had seen earlier was still up there. It looked like a dark shape, and it was definitely not a bird. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to shake off my unease, thinking it was just my imagination. But as the night wore on, the scratching sound continued, growing louder and more persistent. Around midnight, I decided to get up and check. I didn't want to alarm my friends, so I crept away from the campsite. As I approached the tree, the scratching stopped abruptly. I looked up, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. I felt a presence, though, like I was being watched. The air seemed colder, and the silence was heavy. I turned to head back, but then I heard a soft, eerie whisper that sent shivers through me. It was like someone was trying to speak, but the words were too faint to understand. Suddenly, I saw a movement at the top of the tree. A figure emerged from the shadows, slowly lowering itself down. It wasn't like any creature I had ever seen. It had a humanoid shape but was twisted and unnaturally thin. Its skin was pale and almost transparent, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dark. I froze, my heart racing. The figure moved with an unsettling grace, climbing down the tree with an eerie fluidity. Its limbs were elongated, and it seemed to stretch and bend in ways that were impossible for a normal person. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure reached the ground and stood still, its head turning slowly to face me. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold, paralyzing fear. The whispering started again, growing louder and more frantic. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking uncontrollably. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I heard the figure moving behind me, the sound of its steps getting closer and closer. I reached the campsite. My friends were still asleep. I was breathless and panicked, trying to wake them up. But my fear was overwhelming. Finally, I managed to shake them awake, and we packed up our things in a frenzy. As we drove away, I glanced back at the woods. The tree stood silent and still, but I knew that something terrifying had been watching us from above. The experience left a deep scar, and I vowed never to camp there again. To this day, I can't shake the memory of those glowing eyes and the whispering voice. Whenever I hear the sound of scratching in the dark, I can't help but remember the creature that lived in the trees. It's a story I keep to myself, hoping that the fear will fade with time. It was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip. My friends and I had driven out to a secluded spot in California, far away from the busy city. We set up our tents near a small, serene lake, surrounded by tall trees and the sounds of nature. We were excited for a weekend of hiking, fishing, and stories around the campfire. That first night, everything felt normal. We laughed and shared ghost stories, the kind that always seemed scarier in the dark. As the fire died down, we retreated to our tents, the stars shining brightly above us. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the gentle sounds of the forest. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. There was a strange noise outside, like a huge rustling, almost like a storm was brewing. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the wind, but the noise grew louder, and it felt like something was moving around the campsite. I unzipped my tent quietly and peeked outside. The moonlight was dim, but I saw something large moving through the trees. My heart raced as I tried to make out what it was. It looked like a shadow, but it was enormous, easily the size of a car. I woke up my friends, whispering urgently. They grumbled at first, but when they saw the worried look on my face, they quickly became alert. We all peered out of the tent, trying to see what was causing the commotion. Suddenly, a massive bird emerged from the trees. Its wings spread wide, and they seemed to stretch forever. It was unlike any bird we had ever seen before. The feathers were a dark mottled gray, and its eyes glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light. The bird landed near the edge of the lake with a thud that shook the ground. Its beak was long and curved, and it let out a screech that sent chills down our spines. The sound echoed through the forest, piercing the stillness of the night. We huddled together, barely breathing. The bird seemed to be searching for something, its head bobbing back and forth as it peered into the water and the surrounding trees. Its size made it clear that it was no ordinary creature. One of my friends, Tom, tried to grab his flashlight, but I stopped him. "Don't move," I whispered, afraid that any sudden movement might attract the bird's attention. We watched in tense silence, hoping that it wouldn't notice us. The bird let out another haunting screech, and we saw it spread its wings again, preparing to take off. It was then that we noticed something even more disturbing, a faint, eerie glow coming from its feathers. It seemed like the bird was somehow absorbing the moonlight, making it look even more menacing. As it lifted off, the ground seemed to shake once more, and the screeching sound grew fainter as it disappeared into the night sky. We waited for what felt like hours before daring to move. When we finally emerged from our tents, the campsite was eerily quiet. The lake was calm and there was no sign of the bird, but we couldn't shake the feeling of dread. We decided to pack up and leave early. As we drove away, I looked back at the forest, wondering if we would ever understand what we had seen. We never spoke much about that night again. It was as if the bird and everything that happened were too strange, too frightening to discuss. All we knew was that we had encountered something beyond our comprehension, something that had forever changed our perception of the world. Even now, years later, I can't forget the sight of that giant bird or the fear that gripped us. It was a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some creatures are better left undiscovered. I had always loved camping, and this trip promised to be a great one. My friends and I had chosen a spot deep in the forest. The trees were tall and dense, their branches twisting like old, gnarled fingers. The air was crisp and cool, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant calls of nightbirds. That evening we set up our tents and gathered around the campfire. The crackling flames painted dancing shadows on the trees, and we roasted marshmallows, laughing and telling stories. Everything seemed perfect until the night grew darker and the forest quieted. It was then that I first noticed the silence. The usual night sounds, the chirping of crickets and the rustle of small animals, had vanished. An eerie stillness settled over the camp. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the quiet was too heavy, almost as if the forest was holding its breath. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. As I moved away from the fire's light, the darkness felt thick and suffocating. My flashlight barely pierced the blackness, and shadows seemed to shift and swirl around me. Every now and then a twig snapped underfoot, making me jump. Then I saw it. A large twisted shape coiled around the base of a tree. My heart skipped a beat. It looked like a snake, but unlike any snake I had ever seen. This one was enormous, with scales that glistened oddly in the flashlight's beam. What was even more terrifying was that it had legs. Short, stubby legs like those of a lizard, but with sharp claws. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The snake's body was massive, thicker than a tree trunk, and it seemed to writhe and pulse as if alive in a way I had never seen. Its most horrifying feature, though, was its head. Instead of a pair of eyes, it had one enormous eye right in the center of its face. That eye was unlike anything I had ever encountered. It glowed with a sickly yellow light, casting an unsettling sheen on the forest floor. As it stared directly at me, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as though the eye could see right into my soul, and I couldn't look away. The snake's mouth opened slightly, revealing fangs that looked as long as my arm. I could see the glistening venom dripping from the tips. The eye never blinked, and the snake's movements were slow but deliberate. It shifted its massive body, and the legs clawed at the ground, making a scraping noise that echoed through the silent forest. I took a step back, trying to stay as quiet as possible. My mind raced with fear and confusion. What kind of creature was this? The more I looked, the more I felt a sense of dread. The snake seemed to be waiting, its eye locked on me, as if it was assessing whether I was a threat or prey. Suddenly, the snake let out a low, rumbling hiss that seemed to vibrate through the ground. I knew I had to get back to the camp, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the creature. My legs felt like lead as I stumbled backward, trying to remain as quiet as possible. The snake's head followed my movements, the eye unblinking and intense. I managed to turn and run, the branches slapping at my face as I pushed through the underbrush. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I made it back to the camp, gasping for breath and wide-eyed with terror. My friends looked at me with concern as I tried to explain what I had seen. They were skeptical, but the fear in my voice was unmistakable. We decided to pack up and leave, the fun of the trip completely overshadowed by the terror I had witnessed. As we drove away, I glanced back at the dark forest. The image of that glowing eye still burned into my mind. To this day, I can't forget that night. The memory of the giant snake with its one horrifying eye continues to haunt my dreams. I never returned to that forest, and I doubt I ever will. Some places are better left unexplored, and some creatures are best left undisturbed in the shadows of the unknown.